Welcome to tutorial 4 on pressure support ventilation. This is the final tutorial in this mini module, and this tutorial looks at how the breath ends, how the ventilator knows it's time to cycle to expiration, and the problems that you may encounter with expiratory dyssynchrony. Tutorial 11. Pressure support ventilation. Part 4. Cycling to expiration. In the previous tutorial, we looked at adjustments that need to be made to optimize patients' tidal volumes in pressure support ventilation, and we also briefly discussed volume support. In this final tutorial on pressure support, we will look at how the breath ends, how the ventilator flow cycles to expiration, and how it is controlled by changing the expiratory sensitivity. We will then discuss the problems associated with expiratory dyssynchrony. Cycling to expiration. It is essential to understand that pressure support always flow cycles. That means that it cycles to expiration at an operator-controlled percentage of peak flow, a key component in the setup of pressure support. The flow cycling control is somewhere on your ventilator, and it usually pops up on the screen for the settings of pressure support. On Puritan Bennett ventilators, it is known as the Esens or the expiratory sensitivity. On servo ventilators, it is known as the inspiratory cycle off percent, which is a bit more descriptive, but it's a bit of a mouthful. You could always call it the peak flow cycle off percent, but for this part of this tutorial and for the rest of the tutorials on pressure control modes, I'm going to just stick with Esens, although this may not be what's on your ventilator, but you know what I'm talking about. Going back to tutorial 4, I explained the concept of flow cycling, but it's worthwhile to revisit it now. In pressure support, the peak flow is determined by the rise time, the transpulmonary pressure, and the inspiratory pressure. In this case, the peak flow is 60 litres. As the ventilator flow cycles in pressure support, we have set an expiratory sensitivity of 25%. As flow decelerates during inspiration in pressure-limited modes of ventilation, this is the arbitrary point that we may decide to stop inspiratory flow to this patient. Importantly, in pressure support, you must look at the expiratory flow waveform. Just because you have decided that 25% of peak flow is a good time to cycle the ventilator to expiration does not mean that the patient has actually stopped breathing. That little red line is, and we've seen this throughout this course, is the expiratory flow waveform, and it should rise up like a V very nicely because it's elastic recoil, and usually the patient is not participating. In this part, I'm going to add a time component to the patient effort versus flow relationship. In this particular cartoon, you can see that the patient triggers the ventilator generates a flow, and the flow exactly matches the patient's effort. So the patient is inspiring and the flow is being delivered. And as soon as the patient stops inspiring, the flow stops. So it's perfectly matched here. In this situation, you can see that there is a mismatch between the duration of flow and the duration of inspiration. Flow stops while the patient is still inspiring. This anomaly is demonstrated on these waveforms. The way to look at waveforms like these is to start at the beginning and evaluate inspiration, then mid-range, and then expiration. Well, there are no problems on the inspiratory waveform, and mid-range flow here is good, but the expiratory waveform in particular looks all wrong. We're used to seeing the expiratory flow waveforms spring back to the baseline, like I showed you a little bit earlier on. But here there's a strange warble that looks like a W shape in the waveform. Associated with this is a negative gouge in the pressure waveform, although this may not always be apparent. This is known as expiratory dyssynchrony. And what is happening is that the breath that is being delivered to the patient is too short, and the patient is trying to inhale while flow has ceased and it has cycled to exhalation. Because the Esens here has been set at 30%, what you want to do here is to lengthen the breath by reducing the expiratory sensitivity to 25 or perhaps even 20%. This is a different situation again. Here there is also a mismatch between flow and patient effort. You will see that the patient is beginning to expire while the flow is still continuing. So the patient is getting a flow while they're exhaling. And this is what it looks like on these waveforms. Again, early inspiration is normal, but you can see there is a spike on the pressure waveform right here, and that is known as the terminal upstroke. The breath is going on too long, and the patient is trying to exhale while flow is still being delivered. Now, if you look at the Esens here, it's 15%, so the flow cycle percentage is just too low, and the breath is going on too long, and the patient is trying to exhale while flow is still being delivered. And what you want to do here is shorten the expiratory sensitivity down to maybe 20%, 25%, maybe 30%. You need to just fine-tune this and adjust this yourself till you see that perfect pressure waveform. So let's make an adjustment, and here we have changed the expiratory sensitivity to 25%. And now the ventilator will cycle to expiration at 15 litres, assuming that the peak flow is still 60 litres. And let's see what happens. Well, we're familiar with this situation. Here we're showing still some significant expiratory dyssynchrony, but in this situation, the breath is too short. So we've gone from an expiratory sensitivity of 15, where the breath was too long. We've gone to 25%, and the breath is too short, and we're seeing this warbly shaped expiratory flow curve. So this isn't working. Let's dial down the expiratory sensitivity down to 20%, and let's see what happens. And here is the picture. And this is perfect. This is exactly what we want to see. There's no problems in the initial inspiratory flow, there's no problems with mid-range flow, and expiratory flow looks perfect. And this is what we want to see, and this is why you do some dynamic changes of the expiratory sensitivity. And it doesn't always work nicely like this in numbers of 5, it may be 21 or 22% in this particular patient. And sometimes it doesn't work at all. No matter what you do, the patient will stay dysynchronous. Now let's move on to look at some more complex scenarios. You are rounding in the ICU. Liam is 56 years old and he's recovering from ARDS. So his lungs are diseased, but he's getting better. And he's currently on pressure controlled ventilation, but taking a few breaths. Current settings are a driving pressure of 15 centimeters of water over a PEEP of 5. That's a plateau pressure of 20 on an inspiratory time of 1.3 seconds. This results in a tidal volume of 415 mils, a respiratory rate of 14, and a compliance of 13 mils per centimeter of water. Now this is okay, but it's not great. But with reasonable gas exchange and an understanding of the importance of avoiding diaphragmatic dysfunction, you decide to switch the patient over to pressure support ventilation. And now we've put Liam onto pressure support, and this is what we see. Look at the flow and volume waveforms. What you will immediately notice is how low the tidal volume is here compared to what he was getting on pressure control. The pressure support level is exactly the same. He was getting an IP on pressure control of 15 and driving pressure, and it's exactly the same in pressure support. So there's something wrong with the way the pressure support was set up for this particular patient that is not matching the tidal volume that he was getting on pressure control. So where's the problem? Well, If you look at his initial flow waveform, it looks pretty good. He's got a peak flow of about 60 liters. The mid-range flow looks pretty good as well. But the problem here is in the inspiratory time. We had an inspiratory time of 1.3 seconds while he was on pressure control. On this ventilator here, the expiratory sensitivity is set at 30%, which is fairly standard, but these are not normal lungs. They're far less compliant. So we have a problem here. The breath is just too short for the patient's lungs, and the breath is terminating with inadequate tidal volume. There isn't a problem here with expiratory dyssynchrony. The problem is the length of the breath. Try and illustrate this for you. This is a graph. On one axis here you have volume going up to 500 mils, and on the other axis, the x-axis, you have time of up to 1.3 seconds. In a normal lung, it takes a fraction of a second to fill that lung with a tidal volume of 350 mils to 500 mils. That's what happens because the compliance of a normal lung is perfect. It takes minimal distending pressure just to fill up those lungs. But in this situation, Liam's lungs are really badly diseased, and it takes a long time for the gas to pass into lung tissue with long time constants. And I'll discuss this a little bit more when we're talking about pressure control. But what's happening here is the lungs, it's like gas is flowing into something that's like a brick wall, and it needs to find time to distribute itself to all the little nooks and crannies in the lungs so that you can get a nice tidal volume. And that's the great value of time-limited ventilation, that you can give the patient a long inspiratory time. But this can be achieved in pressure support by careful manipulation of the expiratory sensitivity. And what we're going to do here is we're going to drop the inspiratory sensitivity from 30% right down to 15%. And this will significantly lengthen the inspiratory time. And you can see here, we're back here with a pretty generous tidal volume on the same driving pressure as he was getting before, but just with a longer inspiratory time. And that is achieved by reducing the expiratory sensitivity. That's a proportion of peak flow. We're now at 15% of the 60 or 70 liters of peak flow rather than 30% that had previously been set. Again, have a look at the expiratory waveform. It looks absolutely perfect here. Brian is 66 years old and he has a history of COPD. He's currently on volume assist control ventilation, but he's taking breaths, and his current settings are a tidal volume of 450 mils with a plateau pressure of 15 centimeters of water, a PEEP of 5, an inspiratory time of 1 second, and a respiratory rate of 14. His lungs are relatively compliant. You decide to switch him over to pressure support ventilation. Here you can see the expiratory sensitivity is set at a standard 25%. Now let's see what happens to Brian. You will immediately notice how large the tidal volumes are here. They're absolutely humongous compared with the modest tidal volumes he was getting on volume control with the same plateau pressure. Again, you'll notice there is no expiratory dyssynchrony here. The inspiratory flow looks perfect, the mid-range flow looks perfect. So what is the problem? Well, the problem here is the opposite of the problem we had in Liam's case. In Brian's case here, he has highly compliant lungs with a lot of emphysema, and in fact, probably doesn't need any of that PEEP. His compliance would probably be higher without the PEEP that's been set up. And what we have here is a excessively long inspiratory time. Now the inspiratory time was 1 second in volume control, but of course volume control is always volume limited. He may have had very large tidal volumes in pressure control with that 1 second inspiratory time. So we have to kind of guesstimate what kind of inspiratory time we need in somebody like Brian. And so you have to look at the expiratory sensitivity and think, well, perhaps he needs a shorter breath to deliver the goal tidal volume, because these lungs are likely very compliant because he has emphysema. So the breath is really too long for his lungs, and the breath terminates with this enormous tidal volume. So what we're going to do here with Brian is we're going to set an expiratory sensitivity of 35%, and look what happens now. You will notice that the tidal volume is significantly lower than before with exactly the same amount of pressure support. And so I've just shown you how in diseased lungs you can adjust that expiratory sensitivity to adjust the inspiratory time in order to ensure that the patient gets the appropriate tidal volume, really independent of the driving pressure for their lungs if their lungs are diseased. Let's review this tutorial. This was the fourth tutorial on pressure support ventilation, and we looked at flow cycling. This is the end of the breath, how the breath goes from inspiration to expiration. And I explained how you set the expiratory sensitivity. This is also known as the inspiratory flow pressure cycle to off percentage, and all kinds of other terms, none of which are that easy to get your mouth around. I looked at expiratory dyssynchrony in normal lungs where the breath was either too long or too short, and the patient was either trying to exhale while flow was still going on or inhale while flow had stopped. And then we looked at expiratory dyssynchrony in diseased lungs, in particular patients with fibroproliferative ARDS and in patients with COPD. That's the end of this series on pressure support. Next time we will discuss hypoxic respiratory failure. And there's a whole series of discussions on this that I will cover, starting with basic physiology of hypoxemia and hypoxia and the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And in that first tutorial, I'll also discuss pulse oximetry and how we quantify hypoxemia using either the alveolar gas equation, the big A minus small AO2, or the PF ratio. In subsequent tutorials, I'll get into the whole discussion about ventilation perfusion mismatch and shunt and how oxygen works, various different modes of oxygen therapy, and eventually this will lead up to a discussion on the use of CPAP and PEEP. Join me then, and I guarantee you'll learn something. Well, that's the end of this mini module on pressure support. I hope you found it useful. And if you did, please, by word of mouth, tell others to watch these videos. There can never be too much education. From this point on, we're going to move to look at hypoxemia, hypoxia, and why we use PEEP. And from that platform, we'll start looking at pressure control modes of ventilation.